You know, normally watching and reading content produced by vegan YouTubers, journos, bloggers, and other content creators gives me a strong desire to put my fist through the screen of my device. So you can imagine my shock when I read Ed Winter's How to Argue with a Meat Eater and Win, and came away from that not only absent of a desire to throw a fit, but with the book added to my favourite playlist on Audible. This isn't to say that I agreed with it. Quite the contrary, in fact. Nevertheless, it was clearly well written, well researched, demonstrating a genuine grappling with dissenting opinions and different viewpoints, generally coming across as friendly and likeable and without the toxicity that is virtually synonymous with the word vegan, but nonetheless coming from someone who was genuinely passionate about the subject and seemingly using veganism as a tool to aim up, as opposed to the pseudo-moralistic ideology that uses science or misquoted evidence masquerading as science as a club to beat people over the head with and not a tool for expanding human knowledge and subsequently improving the human condition. I bring this up because I have written a book partially inspired by the philosophical issues raised by Peter Singer. Singer has some interesting opinions on a number of topics, but I will be focusing on his essay Equality of Animals in his book Practical Ethics. In this, he essentially argues that there is no such thing as human rights. According to him, Darwin has successfully proven that the difference between humans and animals is a gradient and not a discrete category, and therefore there is no literal Adam and Eve which were made in God's image who are elevated compared to other living creatures. Singer then uses this to argue that values which emphasise or rely on a form of human specialness, such as human rights, are therefore speciesist, essentially an anthropomorphic equivalent to racism, where creatures are judged not by the content of their character, but by their group category in the Linnaean tree. Whilst this may sound weird or unpalatable to viewers first introduced to this, I want to emphasise from the beginning that this is not a criticism of Peter Singer's character. I do not know Peter Singer personally, and from what I have seen online he is generally friendly and respectful in his academic debates, and he does not reek of the supercilious contempt characteristic of others in the vegan community, even if certain phrasings in his book could be worded in a more respectable manner. Additionally, at least I got the impression when I read Peter Singer's book that what he was saying was wrong, but it was very difficult to say why exactly, and I didn't really buy the argument that this was fundamentally due to my inculcated speciesism, and a similar, albeit to a lesser extent experience, happened when I read Ed Winter's book. Given that both Winters and Singer are the two strongest mouthpieces for the vegan movement and the ethical basis underneath it, given that they both complement each other nicely, with Winters focusing more on the practical details involving scientific arguments, and Singer focusing more on the metaphysical foundations of veganism, and given that they are in the minority of vegans that don't make me want to shove a sharp pencil up my nose and bang my head on the table every time I listen to what they have to say, I figured I was in a particularly good position for addressing the points they bring up in their respective books. Part 1. Plant Consciousness. The first argument I will be addressing is Peter Singer's stance on plant consciousness. This argument was also touched upon by Winters, however his justification is not as good in my opinion. Winters' argument is essentially that plants do not have a nervous system and therefore cannot be conscious in the same way that humans are, but that is a very shaky foundation for assuming anything about consciousness. Firstly, it assumes a materialistic stance, where consciousness can be reduced to materialistic constructs, i.e. the nervous tissue, and nothing else. To say this is controversial amongst philosophers specialising in the mind-body problem is a radical understatement, with books exploring the materialistic arguments for consciousness being radically savaged by critics. And the fact that this has not been addressed by Winters is a serious hole in the foundation of his philosophy. Secondly, even if you assume consciousness is reducible to the material, that does not mean it is reducible to human and animal brains. This is largely because you have the same problem with Darwin's theory encroaching into the fields of consciousness, that there is no obvious dividing line between plant and animal in the evolutionary timescale. It may seem obvious to you that there are creatures with brains and creatures without brains, but the nervous system, like everything, evolved through the gradient of natural selection. Even basic amoebas have many of the same chemicals found in human nervous systems organising their cellular interiors, with leading scientists in consciousness therefore arguing that they have a form of sentience, albeit one not as profound as human sentience. If this is the case for amoebas, you can therefore imagine that a strong case can be made that rather than human beings being the pinnacle of consciousness, with animals being less conscious as they get less similar to humans, it is more likely that sophisticated plants like oak trees have a form of consciousness radically different from what human beings can conceptualize, which is nonetheless more sophisticated than that of comparatively less sophisticated animals, like earthworms. Indeed, Peter Singer even makes this case that eating certain types of seafood, namely oysters, is completely ethical in his view, and therefore his stance is what I will focus on. In his most recent book, Singer says he is more sympathetic to the views that plants have some form of consciousness than he was in his original thesis. However, he still says that we have a moral obligation to eat creatures with less sentience and capability of feeling pain over those with more, which still means overall we have an obligation to eat less animals and more plants. The problem with this philosophy is that Singer has not taken it to its logical conclusion. If plants are, let's say, for argument's sake, 10% as conscious as human beings, then if I eat on average 3 plants a day, that equates to 21 plants a week, 192 plants a year. If Peter Singer lives until he's 90, then that's another 10,000 plant murders or 1,000 human murders he is committing. Given his utilitarian basis, the ethical thing for him to do is to kill himself, alongside his closest friends, family, and as many people as he can, because for each one person he kills, he saves another 1,000 lives, or, more equivalent. On the assumption that he is not going to do this, it must be because there is something telling him that this is not ethical, and that is where I believe the errors in his philosophy lie. You see, Peter Singer a priori assumes a utilitarian stance, that the ultimate good is that which is good for the majority given the circumstances. Of course, no one would make the argument that, all things considered, it is better to save 2 people's lives instead of 1, but that is completely different from saying that the greatest good for the greatest number is the highest of all goods barring none. Huxley's Brave New World, for instance, has John the protagonist leaving the hedonic utopia where the greatest good for the greatest number is taken to its logical conclusion, and instead puts him through immense suffering to the benefit of no one because he believes character development is a higher goal. Other cultures have religious orientations. The Judeo-Christian emphasis on God above all else is the idea that there is a spirit of goodness that emerges from aiming at goals where the good is aimed at multiple levels of analysis simultaneously, and this spirit of goodness should be aimed at directly with human desires being placed secondarily to that. Many other cultures throughout history have given many different answers to the question of what should be aimed at as a highest goal, and which is correct is not the topic of this essay. I mostly point this out as Peter Singer's stance on utilitarianism has not been appropriately fortified at the ground level, and this means that if his argument is utilitarianism is correct, Peter Singer's logic is correct, therefore human beings have no rights, there is nothing stopping me from reversing that and saying human beings have rights, Peter Singer's logic is correct, therefore utilitarianism is wrong, and I think that is a fatal flaw in his argument. Part 2. Diet. To introduce why the vegan argument on diet is not as strong as it may initially seem, I need to address a common misunderstanding about how science works. The idea that whole disciplines and universities can be corrupt is often a belief that is associated with radical ideological movements like young earth creationists or flat earthers so they can conveniently ignore scientific evidence that is contrary to their beliefs. This overlooks the fact that whole disciplines have been corrupt in universities in the past. We know, for instance, that eugenics was once a dominant strain of thought in academia, especially if you lived in areas like Nazi Germany, although this happened in the West as well to a lesser extent. If your argument against eugenics was ahead of its time, it was not implausible that you would be told, but there are all these leading scientists who believe in eugenics, with the implicit or not so implicit belief that if you were against these scientists' opinion, then you were therefore a science denier, or anti-science. The opening of Shen Liao's infamous The Three-Body Problem shows a physics professor during the Chinese Cultural Revolution being beaten with a belt for teaching the reactionary doctrine that the universe was created by the Big Bang, and for teaching Einstein's theory of relativity, and this being seconded by academics kowtowed into science by the revolutionary Red Guards. Even today, there is all sorts of controversy about wokeism in universities, particularly in disciplines like gender studies and sociology, and all sorts of controversies about top academics being charged with serious allegations. The point being, while science is a valuable tool that can be used to shine a light on the unknown, it only works if it is neatly balanced inside a collective societal mindset with a healthy ideological framework. This is in part why fields of science generally considered controversial, such as climate and many of the social sciences, are generally considered to be weaker disciplines to the less controversial subjects such as particle physics. Dietary literature in particular is a very controversial field of science, so whilst this doesn't necessarily mean that it cannot provide useful insights, it does mean that those insights need to be taken with a grain of salt, as it is very easy for those with an agenda to misrepresent the information to push an ideological narrative under the pseudonym of science. For instance, it is not infrequently argued that there is a mountain of studies proving that red meat is bad, and that vegetarianism and veganism is better for you by comparison. The problem is, considering what we have above mentioned, simply having more articles showing that red meat is bad is not necessarily evidence that the minority is wrong. The quality of science is more important than the quantity. This meta-analysis from Nature, for instance, shows that around half of the articles it cites show a moderate correlation with eating meat and negative health, the other half show it has no problems at all, and that averages out to the evidence overall showing a weak trend towards vegetarianism being healthier, even though the evidence like this is far from conclusive, and the authors themselves notice this. If you look up meta-analysis like this on Google Scholar, a lot of them are very similar in terms of their methodology, which is a real problem for someone like Ed Winters, whose research relies heavily on them. In fact, being somewhat biased in the genomics direction, I happen to know that much of health research is being pushed in the direction of personalised medicine through research in genomics, and I suspect diet is moving in a similar direction. For instance, the field of pharmacogenomics has found that doing genomic screenings and tailoring a person's quantity and the type of drugs administered based on their personal results can reduce the chance of providing incorrect doses, unwanted side effects, and ineffective treatments. Warfarin, as an example, is an anticoagulant used to prevent blood clots. However, different people have different quantities of the enzyme that breaks down the chemical into its active components. If you give someone too much, they bleed excessively, increasing the likelihood of unwanted health consequences. But if you give them too little, the drug does not work effectively, minimizing the efficiency of treatment. Genomic screening has therefore been a godsend for many of these people who need treatment. If this is the case for particular drugs, such as warfarin, imagine how different the reactions will be to something as chemically complex as broccoli. It could easily be the case that while some people respond very well to a vegan diet, as Winter suggests, it could be that others respond particularly well to a carnivore diet. It could be that some respond well to a high-carb diet, as evidenced by the fact that Okinawans had a very good diet before their island was overrun by ultra-processed food companies, whereas others respond particularly well to ketogenic diets. This is not to say that there are not overall trends in dietary advice which are common to all people, irrespective of their genomes. Whether you're a vegan, carnivore, keto, paleo, or something else, if you eat rat poison, you will die. Much of this argument has resulted in a backlash against ultra-processed food from people of a wide variety of dietary perspectives, because as Ed Winters himself points out, you can be vegan and still be unhealthy. I bring this up because I am therefore sceptical of diets that are marketed as a one-size-fits-all, including but not limited to veganism. Of course, you will point out that this is not the scientific consensus, and you are correct. However, history demonstrates that scientific consensus changes all the time. When I did introductory psychology at university, I was taught that the field was originally dominated by psychoanalysts, then by Gestalt psychologists, then by behaviorists, then by the cognitive revolution, and so on. Different scientists from different periods thought different things, and this changes radically with time. My argument is that the paradigm is changing again, this time in medicine. We are just at the very start, and therefore the consequences have not manifested themselves yet. To therefore state that my stance is contradictory to the majority of dietary researchers and doctors is therefore a disingenuous argument. I should also, however, point out that this is simply a footnote in the story of veganism. It's an important footnote, which is why I spent so much time on it, but neither Winters nor Singer make the argument that veganism is the superior diet for your health. They simply point out that it is good enough for you to have a healthy and happy life, and that there is no good reason from a health perspective to not replace omnivory or carnivory with veganism. This, by itself, is not an ethical argument. Even if you are generous and assume that eating red meat is equivalent to smoking in regards to your health, if you want to smoke a cigarette, that's your choice. You could make the case that it is unethical to teach your kids to eat meat. However, there are plenty of studies showing that kids on vegan diets are more at risk of numerous but different health conditions to those on meat-heavy diets, so it's not like this isn't a double-edged sword. The emphasis on diet is generally more done to stop this from being used as an excuse against becoming vegan by the more honest and fair commentators, as opposed to a tool that's used to own people who disagree with you over the internet, so I have not addressed the science behind the supposed benefits of the carnivore and vegan diets in great detail. You can find many other YouTubers who have looked into that subject more thoroughly than what I have here. Part 3. Environmentalism. This is an argument which is primarily targeted towards Peter Singer because he played a non-trivial role in the foundation of effective altruism, the head of which, William MacAskill, who is also an environmentalist, who is vegetarian, who is well read in this subject, and who was highly influenced by Peter Singer, has literally pointed out that the environmentalist argument for veganism is extremely weak when you look at it through an EA perspective. This is because the vegan argument usually compares carbon emissions from meat eaters and vegans to conclude that veganism is superior environmentally, rather than looking at the net sum of all things you could do to help the planet from an environmentalist perspective. If you take that perspective, then veganism becomes absolutely trivial by comparison. The example that MacAskill brings up in his book is related to a charity called Cool Earth, where he points out that giving just 3 Great British pounds a week is enough to offset an person's entire carbon footprint. If you assume that animal agriculture contributes to 10% of the footprint in the country Australia, where I currently reside, and therefore if I went 100% vegan my footprint would shrink by 1/10, then donating just $5 a week to this charity does more good than going vegan by a factor of 10. Vegan mince at my local Woolworths is about $18 a kilo, and regular mince is $11 a kilo, and I eat 1.5 kilos every week. Given the extra politics that veganism inserts into one's personal life, the fact that there are less stressful ways of achieving more good for the planet is a stronger argument that Singer in particular has not sufficiently addressed. The same comparison can be given for other aspects of environmentalism as well. If you are worried that I have brought up CO2 emissions but not addressed the methane question, I could equally point to research on Asparagopsis taxiformis, which has been shown to reduce methane emissions by more than 90% without impacting animal welfare, quality of produce, or other important metrics, strongly suggesting that green R&D into this and other subjects allows us to have our cake and eat it too. If you care about land usage, I could point to Xiaopeng Song at the University of Washington, who pointed out that net deforestation is only really occurring in countries with high proportions of poor individuals who have to sell their soul to the logging companies in order to stop their families from dying. In the rich West, there is actually a net decrease in land use as agriculture gets more efficient and cities get more compact. Addressing global poverty, therefore, not only has obvious humanitarian benefits, but seems to do more for a global land use reduction than non-humanitarian impacts directly involving land usage. If you care about veganism because you believe that we could be using food otherwise fed to animals to feed the global south, I could point to Bjorn Lomborg's research showing around a dozen ways of helping the global poor which are more cost-effective, as well as more effective period at ameliorating poverty and malnutrition. This includes the introduction of land rights, meaning poor farmers in third world countries actually own the land they live on, providing them with incentives to invest in the land and improve the ability to cultivate food efficiently. It includes the introduction of supplements, such as calcium and micronutrients to make up for poor diets, allowing children to still get the micronutrients they need, not develop permanent cognitive stunting, and therefore improves the chances that poor children can live fulfilling and productive lives. It includes investing into deworming and preventative disease measures that stop millions of children from dying needlessly, etc. All this is to say, if you want to solve a problem like environmentalism, it is best to focus on that individual problem directly within the environmentalism that you care about. Instead of having an overarching meta-construct that promises to solve everything, as the vegans insist with their environmentalist stance, it is more sensible to have a high-resolution plan with many facets to address the many constituent problems that environmentalists concern themselves with, each facet tailored to solve its focus problem exceptionally well. Part 4. Animal Rights. This is a subject I will have to address more deeply in the second video, assuming that ever gets made. This is mostly because it has not been addressed in great detail by the carnivores, even though it is probably the most important central part of the vegan argument, and it is therefore impossible to know where to start in my research, where almost all of the sources come from the more unpalatable and unreliable end of the vegan spectrum. If I want to watch something like a Jordan Peterson podcast or read a Frank Midlaner blog to get the other side of the argument with regards to animal agriculture, I just cannot find anything that seriously addresses this issue. At the moment, given my contentions with the vegan argument, I am uncomfortable giving up meat and dairy entirely, especially because I am 6'5" and very skinny, so I need to eat a high-calorie, high-protein diet. However, I am also uncomfortable supporting industries that are exploitative towards animals, and I do not have a high enough resolution of the subject to give informed opinions. Given that pro-meat eaters will talk about how well beef cows and lambs are treated in Australia, and anti-meat proponents will focus on how badly chicken and pigs are treated, at the moment I am eating primarily red meat. I have already mentioned that I am extremely sceptical of literature pointing to red meat as bad for one's health, and there is a good family history of me personally of people eating bovine heavy diets and leaving well into old age, so I feel justified in that. I have also personally been to the dairy farms in my state, or at least some of them, and they made convincing cases that they were listening to customer complaints surrounding sending calves to the veal industry and other issues with animal welfare and dairy. Combined with my personal witnessing of how well the animals were treated, I have decided to keep dairy in my diet as well. I have also allowed myself to have eggs, so long as they are free range. The arguments against free range eggs normally come from each chicken having on average X amount of space each.
Organic farming regulations are designed to grant animals a minimum of comfort. The problem is that organic is an elastic term. According to EU regulations, an organic hen still might share 1 square metre of space with 5 others. That's a long way off from happy farmyard chickens.
However, this paints a much more grim picture of hens crammed into claustrophobic tightness than what free range actually means. Sunny Eggs Queensland, for instance, is one of the largest distributors of eggs in Australia, and their eggs are raised in a giant barn where hens sleep and lay eggs, but they also have an outdoors area for those who wish to stretch their legs and go outside. To say this is comparable to a prison system is like saying that London is equivalent to a concentration camp because 10 million people are crammed into a 20-kilometre squared area. In other words, as long as you do some basic research into where your animal products come from, and as long as you are doing logical things like buying free range over caged eggs, then generally you can avoid the worst of the animal abuse by simply using common sense. Of course, Ed Winters argues that even outside of factory farm conditions, animals still have poor lives. According to him, they are born, then separated from their mothers at an early age, they are crated around in the backs of trucks, often terrified and alone, They are forced to undergo painful surgeries like dehorning and neutering, and growing up in environments very different from those they are evolved to, often causing insufficient social development and lower quality of life. When we have used them for all they are worth, they are then given an electric shock, their throats are slit, their bodies are hung upside down, and their carcasses sold to the highest bidder. How could we ethically justify bringing such a life into this world? Before I continue, there are definitely animal welfare issues in agriculture that are serious problems, and trying to do something about them is a noble and honourable goal. Anyone who has actually been to a farm like this, again, excluding those animals which are factory farmed but instead raised in conditions that everyone would consider much more acceptable, will know that these animals are generally calm, tranquil around humans, and often friendly. I could equally describe the life of a pet dog as a young pup, taken from her mother from a young age, forced to undergo surgery such as neutering and other painful procedures, before being forced to serve as a secondary, almost slave-like position in the family, often dealing with innate problems with health due to being bred for conditions you were not evolutionarily designed for, before succumbing to a slow, painful illness and being shot by a veterinarian in the back of the neck. Right? Of course, such a representation of a dog's life is deliberately negative, overlooking the fact that many of these procedures are entirely justified. For instance, if I adopt a stray as a family dog, I don't want it to be aggressive around my children. And whilst these arguments could be used for improving the lives of dogs overall, no one would use them to suggest that we should ban the sale of pets entirely. Considering that many sources calling out farms for animal rights abuses are of poor reputational quality, I am still not convinced that the harm my local farmer inflicts is severe enough for me to justify veganism. Having said that, my stance on this subject is not particularly high resolution, so I will come back to this in a future date to make sure I am genuinely doing what is the best all things considered. Conclusion. This is just my stance. I felt that there was something wrong about the vegan argument, and I attempted to put my finger on it, because I am morally opposed to doing things unless I can state exactly why my conscience disapproves. The fact that this was not motivated in a strictly fact-based rationalistic approach is not by itself evidence that it was wrong, however. Winston Smith knows he's right in 1984, even though everything is telling him he is wrong, and making sure those feelings of something's off are sufficiently satisfied is something that everyone will need if they are to genuinely embrace veganism. I would therefore recommend to any vegans watching this, especially those unsatisfied with my arguments, to really try and create a devil's advocate position verbalizing why people might disagree with you even if they can't say why, assuming that their stance is more sophisticated than because they like the taste of it. I like the taste of KFC. That is completely different from liking the taste of a deeply satisfying Christmas dinner with my friends and family, and replacing the magic that creates with a vegan alternative does more than change the taste. If you can adequately identify why people do not like veganism with exactitude, whilst remaining honest and respectful to those of different positions, then turning the world vegan will be a lot easier for you and people like you.